Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second lesson of this week. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the concepts of modernity and then also postmodernity. And we're going to be doing this through the work of Zygmunt Bauman. Zygmunt Bauman was a Polish sociologist, and he became quite famous from his reading that you have from today, his book, Modernity and the Holocaust. So we're going to be doing three general things in this lesson. First, we're going to talk just in general terms about the concepts of modernity and then postmodernity. What do those concepts mean? And then we're going to see how Bauman connects to both of those concepts. So first, we're going to see how he connects the experience of the Holocaust to modernity. And then in the last part of the lesson, we're going to see how he describes postmodernity, right? Postmodern society, what he terms or what he calls liquid modernity. Okay, so let's begin by first talking generally about the concepts of modernity and then postmodernity. So let's begin with modernity. So really the first thing to understand about modernity is when we use the term modernity, we're not talking about the 20th century, we're not talking about the 21st century, we're not talking about contemporary times, right? Modernity as a time period of history is really something that is thought to have started around the 1600s, right? So we're really talking about the last 300 to 400 years. And so when sociologists and historians use the term modern or modernity, we're not talking about now, we're talking about a time period that we as a society have been living in for, at least a few hundred years. So what is modernity, right? If modernity is our contemporary society of the last 300 to 400 years, what is it? So modernity is characterized by a few things. So I'm going to describe a few things and then really collect it all together with a concept at the end. So what's the first thing? One is control over nature, right? So that for a long time and period of human society and human life, nature was something that really had control over us, right? Droughts would come, earthquakes would happen, calamities would befall human society, and there was really nothing that much we could do about it. But the idea is that in the last 300 or 400 years, we really developed a more secure control over nature, right? We solved some of the basic problems of society. And when I'm saying, modern society, we're really talking about the West, right? We're really talking about Western Europe and North America, and some other regions that have been characterized as the West and what we might now call, the developed world, right? And so in the West, in the developed world, there has been this kind of control over nature, right? We solved some kind of basic problems of, providing enough food for people to eat, and some control over, the natural world. How did we gain this control over the natural world? And partly it was through what's been called the scientific revolution, right? So the rise of empirical science. So, and this is really a change in the understanding of knowledge. So for a long time, what it meant to be knowledgeable or what it meant to know something was just to have that knowledge handed down from the past, right? That, for a long time in European history, to be knowledgeable was just to be able to know the knowledge of the ancients. This was, ancient Greek, ancient Rome. And so basically you would be knowledgeable by reading these kind of dusty old books of the past and, knowing what Aristotle and Plato said. And if you could remember all that and you were just kind of, had this knowledge in your head, you were a knowledgeable person. With the scientific revolution and the idea of science, that really changed. Rather than thinking of knowledge as just being received from the past and then handed on, there became this really amazing idea of creating new knowledge, right? that what you would do is go out into the world and discover something new, right? Creating or producing knowledge rather than just having knowledge handed down from the past. And so really became this idea of newness, right? That you could create knowledge that nobody else had ever known before. So how would you do this? You would do it through science, right? This is the idea of the scientific revolution, right? So rather than just simply accepting what people had told you or just accepting the world as is, you would question the world and you say, okay, well, let me use my senses, my empirical understanding of the world. Let me go out and see it for myself and create knowledge based on my observations. Right? And so in the 1600s and 1700s, there was a whole kind of new development of science, right? There was telescopes in which you could observe the planets. There was new theories like theories of gravity, a whole creation of, let's develop and create new knowledge, right? And so this is, the way the early scientists talked about this is rather than reading the book of the ancients, we should read the book of nature, right? We're going to make our own observations. We're going to create new knowledge. And then along with all this was an emphasis on reason and rationality, right? So just rather than just accepting things or rather than just taking things for granted, the idea was that you should think through things rationally and logically, right? That you should be objective, right? You should not be ruled by your emotions. You should have, put everything in order, right? So, you have a series of premises and they lead, to a conclusion, right? And so everything has to be, kind of unemotional and just kind of logical and rational, right? And so to bring this all together, really what this was coming together was this idea of progress, right? That what really sums up the idea of modernity is a new sense of time. So for a long period of history, people just thought of time as kind of a circle, right? Year in, year out, the change of the seasons. Or if it wasn't a circle, it was, just waiting around for kind of a final judgment, right? Just kind of a religious idea of, a second coming, that we're just doing things, we're waiting it out until, there's the end of the world. But what happened with modernity was really a change in the understanding of time. What was a change? It was an idea of progress, right? That we could make things better, right? That this year was going to be better than the last year, and next year is going to be better than that. And so there was this kind of image of kind of climbing the staircase, right? That every year life and society was going to get better and we're going to climbing up this process of time. So that really sums it up. And this is what, is summed up in terms of this concept of the Enlightenment by, this kind of famous philosopher, Immanuel Kant, right? So what he says is that, really what is enlightenment? And by enlightenment, he means what we call modernity, right? That you have humans begin to trust themselves. They begin to have courage, the courage that they can produce new knowledge, and they see a future, right? A future in which there's this kind of progress to a better society. So that's modernity, right? The idea of kind of idea of progress, of things getting better, a trust in yourself, a trust in human reason, right? A trust in science, and above all, human kind of rationality. Okay, so if that is modernity, right, what is post-modernity, or what is postmodernism? Right? So first we have to make a few clarifications. All right, so the first clarification we have to make is between the concept of postmodernism and postmodernity. So what is this distinction between postmodernism and postmodernity? Okay, so postmodernism is really the idea of an intellectual movement, right? It's a intellectual and artistic movement. So you can be a postmodern thinker, or you can be a postmodern artist, right? And that's distinct from this idea of postmodernity. Postmodernity is not an intellectual movement, rather it's a type of society, right? So we have to kind of make that distinction, right? Postmodernism is an intellectual and artistic movement. Postmodernity is a description of society. So what we're really interested in is postmodernity, right? So we can leave postmodernism to another lesson, somebody else's lesson. We're in this class, this video lecture, we're really interested in postmodernity, right? So now the question is, okay, what is postmodernity really like? What is a postmodern society? So not surprisingly, the idea of postmodern is really this idea that in the 20th century, the mid 20th century, something happened to create a split or a rupture that we no longer live in a modern society, a society that we've been living in from the 1600s, but now something happened that now it's such a dramatic change in our society that now we're post-modern, right? We have left modernity behind, and we are now entering a new historical time period that we describe, or has been described, as postmodern. And so what is postmodern society? So really it's, in some ways, it's a criticism or critique, or a backlash against modernity, right? So what is the backlash against? Postmodernity and postmodern society is really a criticism of the idea of progress, right? So if modernity is characterized by the idea of progress, things always, ever and ever getting better, postmodernity is really characterized by a dismissal, or a kind of a pessimism about progress, right? It's really a questioning of whether the world is actually getting better, and really a doubt about this whole idea of progress. And so really this postmodern society is really living during a time period in which people and society have lost hope. We've lost hope in the idea of a better future. So this is in some sense summed up by Lyotard, which I have a quote here from in your handout. Right, so Jean-Francois Lyotard kind of wrote this famous book called The Postmodern Condition, in which he tries to sum up what a postmodern society is like. And he defines it as what he is kind of has become kind of famous as an incredulity toward meta-narratives. Okay, so it's kind of a lot of jargon there, so we have to break this down. So first off, what is a meta-narrative? So a meta-narrative is a grand description of society, right? A kind of an overarching or big picture of what everything is. It's a big theory, right? So what could a meta-narrative be? A meta-narrative could be something like Christianity, right? Christianity is a meta-narrative. It describes, what it means to be good and bad. It describes what the meaning of the world is. It describes what happens when you die, right? Christianity as a religion is also a meta-narrative. It's a big theory about what the world is like and what people are like. What's another meta-narrative? Another meta-narrative is the idea of progress, right? Modernity is a meta-narrative, right? The idea of things always getting better and better. Science is a meta-narrative, right? the belief that humans can create objective knowledge using their reason about the world. That's a kind of a theory about what humans are like and what society is like. And so the idea of incredulity is really a doubt or a loss of faith in these big theories. And so the idea of postmodernity is really this idea that we have lost our way, right? We no longer have faith or hope in this modern promise, right? This promise of progress, but we don't really know where to go from there, right? It's not that we have something that replaces that theory, because that a replacement would just be another meta-narrative. But what our postmodern condition is we've lost hope in all these explanations. And so we're like a society that no longer has hope. The last thing to distinguish is the concept, the distinction between postmodernity and what is sometimes called late modernity. And this is kind of an argument, and we don't have to get hung up on this, but it's important to point out. Postmodernity, the term postmodernity really kind of implies that our society is different from modernity, right? That something happened in the middle of the 20th century that was a complete rupture. And so, on one hand, there's modernity over here, and now over here, there's postmodernity. That the way that we live our life, the way that we do things is so radically different that we can't call ourselves modern. So some people argue that. Some postmodernists say, yes, we are living in a postmodern world in which society is now radically different from the past. However, there's other people who say, look, it's not that we should call this postmodern, but rather we should call it late modern, right? That the time period in which we live is not something radically different. Rather, it's simply another stage of modernity, right? That modernity was always going to end up in late modernity, right? It was always going to end up in this kind of place in which we kind of lost hope with this idea of progress. So we don't need to get hung up in this distinction, postmodern, late modern. It's really, either or. But it's important to understand that some people prefer one term over the other, even though they're really referring to the same thing. And so late modern or postmodern is really the society in which we live now. It's 21st century society in the West. Okay, so all this is pretty abstract and to some degree vague. So let's try to make a little bit more sense of it by using the work of Bauman. And he's going to talk about both of these concepts. He's going to talk about modernity, and he's also going to talk about postmodernity, or what he likes to refer to as liquid modernity. Okay, so let's see what he has to say about modernity first. So the way that he talks about modernity is he talks about it through the historical event of the Holocaust. And it's hard for us, in the 21st century to really understand, but the Holocaust was actually this kind of terrible, awful historical event that changed society forever, right? It was the killing of 6 million people, right? 6 million, mainly Jewish people, that really reverberated ever since. It was a time period in which, it was so awful and so terrible that it was traumatic in the sense that we can't really even now, 60 or 70 years later, deal with it, right? We don't know how to understand the experience of the Holocaust. But it was this kind of incredible, terrible event that really defined the world. And so Bauman is trying to understand the Holocaust. He is trying to give a sociological understanding of what the Holocaust means, right? How he's trying to get a grasp, an intellectual grasp of how we can understand it. Okay, so what does he say? You know, I'm going to kind of take you a little bit through the steps of the reading and kind of lay out his argument in a very kind of condensed form, because obviously this is a book that he, you know, is many pages long. Okay, so where can we begin? So the first thing we can say is he wants to say what the Holocaust is not, right? You know, he first wants to try to say, okay, what should we avoid thinking about the Holocaust? So on one hand, what we might want to say is the Holocaust was just a random event, right? It was something terrible and awful in which the Nazis killed 6 million people in a genocidal mass murder. But it's not really reflective of our society. It's not reflective of us in America. It's not, you know, it's confined to one time period and one group of people, the Nazis or maybe German society in the 1940s, but really we're not like that. That was something barbaric and awful and terrible, but we didn't do that. You know, we're not guilty of this. And we can look at this event with shame, and we can say it's terrible, but we are not personally responsible. It's not part of us or part of our society. And this is what Bauman is going to say no, right? He's going to say, look, actually, you know, we might want to think this. This might make us feel better. Right? It might make us feel better to say, oh, well, the Nazi Germany was just an aberration, right? It was a terrible society and a group of terrible people who did this thing, but it's not reflective of us. Bauman's going to say no, actually. He's going to say the experience of the Holocaust is actually an example of modern life and modern society. That it's modern society that allowed the Holocaust to happen. And so rather than just a fluke event, rather than an aberration, right? Rather than just a single historical case of genocide, the Holocaust is actually an example of modern society. That modern society allowed the Holocaust to happen, and modern society and modernity gave the fruits, or the undercurrents of modernity helped produce the Holocaust. Okay, so what is his argument? How did modernity, this idea of reason and rationality and progress, all this good stuff, how did that produce something so terrible and so awful as the Holocaust? Right? So Bauman is going to make two arguments. He's going to make an argument about motivation, and then he's going to make an argument about means. So let's take these one by one. So we can first talk about motivation, right? That modernity helped provide the motivation to allow the Nazi Germany allows the Germans in the Nazi period to produce the Holocaust. So what did modernity provide? So modernity is, as we remembered, is characterized by the idea of progress. Now, what happens is if you have an idea of progress, what you're going to try to do is you're going to try to improve society, right? You always want to make society better and better. And connected with this idea of progress then is an idea of a perfect or ideal society, what has been called a utopia, right? A society, the idea of progress is eventually you're going to climb this kind of staircase of progress until you get to this ideal society in which the major problems of the world are solved, right? Everything is, the problems that plague us, are now going to be removed, and we're going to be living in a good society, an almost perfect society. So how do you do that, right? So how do you get to a modern society? Well, a modern perfect society, well, you use reason and logic, right? And what does reason and logic do? It wants to produce order. It wants to produce a nice orderly society. It wants to kind of put everything in its place, right? It wants to categorize things, right? This is a kind of a very rational and scientific way of thinking. Categorize things and then put everything that you categorize in its proper place. And then when you've categorized everything, when you've ordered it, then you will have a good society. Okay, so what's the problem with that? That sounds maybe a little bit, too much, but how could that produce the Holocaust? So what Bauman says is the problem with order is that when you try to order society and when you try to order people, there's always going to be a group of people that don't fit into your order. There's always going to be some bunches of people that refuse to be categorized in a nice orderly way, right? And so what happens is that's frustrating. Like, damn, why are these people refusing to be ordered? Why are these people refusing to be categorized in a way that fits into our society? And so he says that lack of order of these kind of people, this minority group of people, is frustrating to this modern society that seeks out order and wants to perfect society. And so what's the solution? Right? What's the final solution? Well, the solution then is to get rid of those people, right? If there's a group of people that refuse to be categorized, if there's a group of people who are standing in your way of creating an ideal, orderly society, the only thing you can really do in the end is to remove those people, right? And so in the end, that is the law, it's a kind of a cold-hearted, logical process, right? That you finally say, okay, well, we want to do this. We want to get to this ideal, perfect society. These are people who are standing in the way. We have to get rid of them. How do you get rid of them? You exterminate them. And so, what Bauman really says is he uses a nice metaphor here. And I have the metaphor listed out in your reading. It's in your reading, and it's also listed out in the handout. And he says, okay, the metaphor is the idea of a garden, right? He says, okay, a garden and a gardener, that's a kind of a classic example of a modern person in a modern society. So what is a gardener trying to do? They're taking nature, they're having control over nature, right? Remember that part of modernity, and they're bringing order to nature. And by bringing order to nature, they're perfecting or making a perfect nature, right? And producing food and all this stuff, right? And so you're taking this kind of raw material of nature and bringing order to it, right? Rows of plants, rows of vegetables, all in kind of neat boxes, right, in your garden. And so what do you have to do in a garden? He says, okay, every garden has to weed, right? Every gardener has to weed, right? There's always this frustrating experience of these weeds getting into your garden and messing things up. And so what do you have to do? You have to weed out, get rid of those weeds to perfect the garden. And so what Bauman says, obviously it's a metaphor, but he says this really makes sense. He says that modern culture is a garden culture. We are a culture, we are a society in the West that seeks out order, that seeks out to perfect things, and by making things orderly. And when things don't conform to that order, then we get rid of them. And so he says that this is an important thing to understand about the Holocaust. There has always been mass murder. There has always been what have been called pogroms, right? And often these mass murders were against Jewish people, right, in the West, right? So there have always been kind of these mass murders that have happened, throughout history, and mass murders often against Jews. But when these mass murders happened in the past, they were typically emotional events. They were the mass murder of riots, right? Society got incensed, society got angry and overwhelmed with kind of this emotion, and they went out and they killed a whole bunch of people. This was terrible, obviously, but that's different than the Holocaust. The Holocaust, as Bauman describes it and others, was not emotional. It was cold and calculated, right? It was not a emotional, angry event. It was on Crystal Night, right? That one riot when Germans went around and broke the windows of a whole bunch of Jewish businesses and killed a whole bunch of people. But after that one event, right, Crystal Night, after that event, it was cold and calculated murder. It wasn't the mass murder of anger. It was the mass murder of a kind of extermination, right? Just kind of doing this thing cold and calculatedly. Okay? Again, modernity is not about emotion. It's about rationality and objective and kind of doing things unemotionally. And so this was an unemotional, cold and calculated genocide. Right? And so he said, he brings us back to the garden, right? That it was, gardeners don't kill weeds because they hate weeds. It's just something you have to do to bring order to nature. And so just like, the gardener kills weeds cold and calculatedly, the Germans, Nazi Germany, killed Jews in a very similar way. Right? And so he says, he has another nice quote. He's quite a good writer, right? He says, the Holocaust is a byproduct of the modern drive to a fully designed, fully controlled world, right? And it's that kind of drive of perfection that kind of got out of control, right? It's kind of went wild. So that's the first thing, right? So that's one part of the motivation. What's the second part of the motivation before talking about the means? So he says the second part of the motivation is another important part of rationality. So in terms of organizations, a rational organization is what's called a bureaucracy. Right? A bureaucracy is what we can think of as the government now. It's what it's how big organizations are run. Right? They're run on rules. Rules are supposed to be objective and unemotional, and everybody's doing their own little task. Right? That you have an organization of thousands of people. Big organizations. It's got thousands of employees. And each one of those employees don't really see the big picture. They just see the little part, their little job that they have to do. Right? And so what Bauman says is living in this kind of bureaucracy that's very rational and kind of just a little person doing their little part, it allows each person in that organization to kind of excuse themselves. Right? They don't see the big picture. They can't see the big picture in a sense. They just see their one little job. And so a person in a bureaucracy doesn't feel, in some sense, responsible for the final product. They're just responsible for their one little part of that product. And so he says this experience of working and living in a bureaucracy allows people to do terrible things, right? Because they don't feel a moral responsibility to the final end product. Right? So he has a couple of examples here, in the reading. One example is, imagine you're some bureaucrat working in Nazi Germany, and what your job is you're have some job to do with the trains, right? Your job is to make sure that some train gets from some city to another city, right? And that there's some train cars on there, and that train cars have some cargo. And so all you are thinking about is, okay, how can you do that efficiently and get that done, right? And that's your one little part of that whole part. What you never think about, what you never conceive of, And what you never feel morally responsible for is what's on that train that you might not even know, right? It could be, sheep. It could be food. It could be people, right? It could be people being sent to a concentration camp. But you never feel like, even if you know that, you never feel like you're killing those people. You never feel responsible for their lives. You feel disconnected from them. You feel a lack of moral empathy because you're not thinking in that way. And so what Bauman also says is modernity produces a way of thinking in which people no longer feel morally responsible for other humans that they can't see, right? They feel disconnected or what he calls distanced from them. And so again, that produces a kind of a way of thinking that allows the Holocaust to happen. Okay, so we got two motivations, right? A desire for order and an ideal society that allows people to kind of kill groups of people that they feel won't fit into that order. And then bureaucracy and rationality that produces a way of thinking that allows people to ignore or not feel morally responsible for what they're doing. So now we can talk about the means. So what Bauman says is, okay, let's imagine that there was some society in the past that hated some group of people like the Jews and hated them so much that they want to kill them all. He says that even if that society wanted to do that, even if they wanted to exterminate some group of people, they wouldn't have the means to do it, right? To kill 100 people, to kill 1,000 people, to kill, even tens of thousands of people. Okay, maybe you can do that. Maybe you can just go out and murder a whole bunch of people. But to kill 6 million people, to identify who the Jewish people are, to round them up, and then to kill 6 million people, that's something that earlier societies couldn't even achieve if they even wanted to do it. But what a modern society is able to do is it's able to do that. Okay, how is it able to do that? Modern societies are incredibly efficient. Why are they efficient? Because they have bureaucracies, right? Bureaucracies give societies incredible tools to achieve kind of grand tasks. And when I mean societies, I actually mean governments, right? That modern governments wield an incredible amount of power that they have never wielded in the past. They can identify people. They can achieve these kind of these grand collective tasks to really kind of get people together. So he says, what modernity also provided was not just a motivation, but the means to do this. The modern state and modern bureaucracy allowed the Nazi Germany to identify, to round up, and then to efficiently exterminate and kill 6 million people. So he says, what we have to understand is that modernity is not something that is just, good. That modernity has actually produced this awful historical event. That modernity, what we know is modern life with all its technological advances, all its economic, fruits, has also produced incredible violence and incredible death, as witnessed in the Holocaust. There's one last part to this that I kind of want to bring up at the end to kind of highlight all of this. What Bauman says is that modernity has not just produced a type of society, it's produced a type of individual, right? It's produced a type of individual morality. It's an individual morality that is incredibly conformist. So to highlight this idea, what Bauman points to is a psychological experiment from the 1970s. It's called the Milgram experiment. And so Bauman says this kind of really brings us the key to understand, how the Holocaust has happened and how modernity allowed it to happen. So I'm going to show a picture of this experiment so you can get a better sense of it. Okay, so what is the Milgram experiment? It's actually kind of an amazing experiment, and it was done, year after year for a long time because the results of it were so kind of amazing in a way. Okay, so what happened? So you were asked, the person being experimented on, you were asked to come into a room. And so you were asked by a scientist in a lab coat, and you were told that there was an experiment happening on a vocabulary test, right? That you were there to test another person when they read a list of words, and if they couldn't pronounce a word correctly, then what would you do? You would give that person a shock, right? A small electric shock, right? And so you can see the person being shocked here, right? So the person being shocked is the person on the right, and then the person doing the shocking is that guy on the left. That could be you walking into this experiment, right? And so what would happen is each time the person would say a word incorrectly, the voltage would go up, right? So you would shock the person a little bit more each time they mispronounced a word. And then eventually you got to the highest level of electric shock, and now the person, if they didn't pronounce a word correctly, was writhing in pain, like this person here. Okay, so obviously this sounds terrible, right? So what's going on? Okay, so you've been tricked, right? So you, the person walking into this experiment, have been tricked. The person getting shocked isn't actually getting shocked. They are pretending, right? There's no actual voltage going into their arm. They're an actor. And so it's not that person being tested, but it's you, right? And so what the experiment is about is whether people in America, so this experiment was done in America, whether people in America would shock somebody simply if they were told to do it for a scientific experiment. And so what were the results? The results were quite surprising. The results were that 3/4 of Americans, so 75% of Americans, would go ahead and shock somebody and would give them the highest level voltage, right? So the vast majority of people, if they walked into this experiment and they were politely told by the scientists conducting it, please go ahead and shock this person, 3/4 of Americans would do this. And so what Bauman says is that this is an example of modernity, right? That this way of thinking, that you would do something for science, that you would do something simply because you were told to do it, right? That you would shock and hurt somebody and not feel a moral connection to that person is an example of a modern individual. And that what modernity has produced is this kind of modern sense of understanding and a kind of a amorality, right? Rather than caring about other humans, we just care about doing what we're told, right? That we are conformist. And so he says, this really helps understand or explain the Holocaust, right? Again, the people, the soldiers, the person working in the bureaucracy of the government, doing the trains, the people, the guards at the concentration camps, everybody was just following orders. It wasn't, a lot of it was not emotional. Obviously there was evil people doing terrible things, but a lot of it was just regular people, you and I, right, doing this awful thing because we were told to do it and because we were conforming. And so for all of this, what Bauman says is that the Holocaust really is not some aberration. It's not some fluke event. It's an example. It's something that happened because of modernity, right? Modern society, the type of society in which we live in, allowed this event to happen. And if we didn't have a modern society, maybe the Holocaust never would have occurred. So this is Bauman's early work. He wrote this book in 1989. It became quite well known, and so he wrote a lot about modernity and what modern society was like. In the last 10 to 15 years, he's only died recently, like within the last 5 years. But after this book, he started to think about not modernity, but about postmodernity. And so the concept that he came up to describe postmodernity, right, this historical period that comes after modernity, is what he calls liquid modernity. So what is liquid modernity? To really kind of summarize this, we can say that liquid modernity is a time period, a historical period in which there is an incredible amount of change. That the rate of change, the pace of change, the pace of progress has gotten ever and ever and ever faster. That now the pace of change is so fast that it's dizzying, right? That it's hard for the people who live in this society to keep track of this pace of change. And so we live in this time period of liquid modernity, where everything is free floating, right? That things are happening so quickly that our society keeps changing its form. And its form changes so quickly that there's no stability to it, right? It's just liquid. It's ever moving, ever changing. And so that's the first, he says, the 21st century, the society in which we now live, is this time period of incredible change, incredible speed that the people within it can't even themselves understand. That's the first part of it. It's a pace of change, a pace of progress that seems out of control. It seems too fast, right? It's like we're speeding. We're in a speeding car and we feel like we can no longer control that vehicle, right? That it's going so fast that we've kind of lost control of the wheel. So that's the kind of, Bauman really likes to use these kind of metaphors. So that's the first part of liquid modernity, or his term for postmodernity. What's the second part? The second part is that's now it's a progress in which we don't even really know what the final destination is. So in earlier time periods, right, in modernity, we had a vision of the future, right? We had a vision of what an ideal society was like. We had an idea of where we were going, right? It might have produced terrible things. It might have produced that ideal vision, right? That utopian vision might have produced something terrible like the Holocaust. But we had that idea, right? We had an image in our head of where we were trying to get to. What Bauman says is that in liquid modernity, we no longer have that sense of a destination, right? We're in the speeding car that feels out of control, and we don't even know where we're going, right? We don't know what the progress is for. We don't know what we're trying to achieve. And so in the end, to kind of end the video lecture for today, he uses a nice metaphor. He says, okay, imagine you're on a plane, right? You're reading your magazine, maybe some people are sitting next to you, you're going somewhere, right? You're going somewhere incredibly fast and you're incredibly high up. And then you begin to wonder, well, where are we going? Who's in control of this plane? Who's flying this plane? So you go up to the front to try to find out where the pilot is. Who's flying this plane? And for some reason, the doors open and you go into the cockpit and you find out there's nobody in there. There are no pilots, right? That this plane, this society is pilotless, right? And so he says that's the real character of the 21st century society and 21st century culture, that we feel out of control and we feel like that there is no destination that we are going to, right? We're going incredibly fast. We're high up in the air. We have this, we're in a dangerous spot, right? But we don't know where we're going. And we have realized that actually nobody knows where we're going. Like, oh, we might not know, but we always had this idea of, well, somebody knows. Somebody in the government knows, or some organization knows what the plan is. But then we discover there is no plan. There is no pilot flying the plane. And so he really says that this is a disconcerting time period to live in. Probably you're all feeling this now, right? With our current events, that this is a disconcerting time period to live in that the pace of change is happening incredibly quickly, and we don't know where we're supposed to be going. We don't have an image of the direction of where, or destination of where we're going. So this is postmodernity. It's a time period of progress, right? So we still have this idea of progress, but it's progress without an end goal, and progress that seems to be ever speeding up. Okay, so this is, Bauman's an interesting person. He's hard to condense in many ways, but this is his kind of main ideas. Connecting the idea of modernity to Holocaust, and then talking about postmodernity through the concept of liquid modernity. Okay, that's it for today.